You have been introduced to the upper limb in the previous study section. You have learned in detail the divisions of the upper limb. This section is the continuation of study section 7, as you will learn other details of the upper limb. In this study section, you shall be introduced to bones and joints of the upper limb. Relax and enjoy the lecture. When you will have studied this study section 8, you should be able to discuss the bones of the upper extremities. You should be able to highlight the joints of the upper limb. Let's start with the clavicle as one of the bone of the upper limbs. The clavicle, also called collarbone, connects the upper limb to the trunk. Its sternal end articulates with the manubrium of the sternum at the sternoclavicular joint. Its acromial ends articulate with the acromion of the scapula at the acromioclavicular joint. The medial two-thirds of the shaft of the clavicle are convex anteriorly, whereas the lateral third is flattened and concave anteriorly. These curvatures increase the resilience of the clavicle and give it the appearance of an elongated capital S. Functions of the clavicle. The clavicle serves as a rigid support from which the scapula and free limbs are suspended, keeping the limbs away from the thorax so that the arm has a maximum freedom of motion. Fixing the struts in position, especially after its elevation, enables elevation of the ribs for deep inspiration. Number 2, clavicle forms one of the boundaries of the cervico-axillary canal, that is passageway between the neck and the arm, affording protection to the neurovascular bundle supplying the upper limb. And 3, cervical transmits shocks, that is traumatic impact, from the upper limb to the axial skeleton. Scapula. Scapula is also called shoulder blade. It's a triangular flat bone that lies on the posterior lateral aspects of the thorax, overlying the 2nd through 7th ribs. Each scapula is triangular bone, and the 3 edges are known as the superior border, the lateral border, and the medial border. As you can see on this slide, the scapular spine is on the posterior surface and it expands into a terminal process known as the acromion process. Above the spine is the supraspinous fossa. Below the spine is the infraspinous fossa. And on the anterior side of the scapula is the subscapular fossa and the coracoid process. The inferior angle of the scapula is at the junction of the medial and lateral border. Inferior to the acromion process is the glenoid fossa. This is a depression where the head of the humerus articulates with the scapula. The humerus. The body of shafts, corpus humeri, is almost cylindrical in the upper half of its extends prismatic and flattened below, and has 3 borders and 3 surfaces. The humera has 1, the anterior border. It runs from the front of the greater tubercle above to the coronoid fossa below, separating the anteromedial from the anterolateral surface. The lateral border, it runs from the back part of the greater tubercle to the lateral epicondyle and separates the anterolateral from the posterior surface. Its upper half is rounded and indistinctly marked, serving for the attachment of the lower part of the insertion of the teres minor, and below this giving origin to the lateral edge of the triceps brachial. Its center is transversed by a broad but shallow oblique depression. The radial sulcus, that is musculospiral groove, its lower part forms a prominent rough margin, a little curve from behind forward. The lateral supracondylar ridge, which presents an anterior lip for the origin of the brachioradialis above, and extensor carpi radialis longus below. A posterior lip for the triceps brachial and an intermediate ridge for the attachment of the lateral intermuscular septum. Proximally, the ball-shaped head of the humerus articulates with the glenoid cavity of the scapula. The intertubercular sulcus, that is the bicipital groove of the proximal end of the humerus, separates the lesser tubercle from the greater tubercle. The shaft of the humerus has two prominent features: the deltoid tuberosity laterally and the radial groove, that is the groove for radial nerve, spiral groove posteriorly for the radial nerve, and deep artery of the arm. The inferior end of the humerus shaft widens as the sharp medial and lateral supracondylar ridge form and then end distally in the prominent medial epicondyle and lateral epicondyle. The lower extremity. The lower extremity is flattened from before backward and curved slightly forward. It ends below in a broad articular surface which is divided into two parts by a slight ridge. The picture you are seeing on the slide shows the feature of a lower extremity of the humerus. You can read more on humerus in the course manual. The ulnar bone. The stabilizing bone of the forearm is the medial and longer of the two forearm bones. Its proximal end has two prominent projections: the olecranon posteriorly and the coronoid process anteriorly. They form the walls of the trochlear notch. The trochlear notch of the ulnar articulates with the trochlea of the humerus. Inferior to the coronoid process is the tuberosity of the ulna. On the lateral side of the coronoid process is a smooth, rounded concavity and radial notch, which articulates with the head of the radius. Distal to the radial notch is a prominent ridge, the supinator crest, and between it and the distal part of the coronoid process is a concavity. The supinator fossa, proximally the shaft of the ulna, is thick, but it tapers, diminishing in diameter distally. At its narrow distal end is the rounded head of ulna with small conical ulnar styloid process. The ulna does not articulate directly with the carpal bones. It is separated from the carpals by a fibrocartilaginous articular disc. Bones of the hands. From lateral to medial, the four bones of the proximal row of carpals are the scaphoid, a boat-shaped bone that has a prominent scaphoid tubercle lunate. We have the lunate, a moon-shaped bone that is broader anteriorly than posteriorly. Then we have the tracrestrum, a pyramidal bone on the medial aspect of the carpus, and we have the pisiform, that is a small pear-shaped bone that lies on the palmar surface of the tracrestrum. Then the proximal surfaces of the distal row of carpus, it articulates with the proximal row of carpus, and their distal surfaces, it articulates with the metacarpus. From lateral to medial, the four bones in the distal row of carpus are the trapezium, that is a four-sided bone on the lateral side of the carpus. We have the trapezoid, a wedge-shaped bone that resembles a trapezium. We have the capitate, the edge-shaped bone, that is the largest bone in the carpus. We have the armate, a wedge-shaped bone which has a hook process, the hook of armate that extends anteriorly. The metacarpus, which forms the skeleton of the palm of the hand between the carpus and the phalanges. It is composed of 5 metacarpal bones. Each metacarpal consists of a base, shaft, and edge. The proximal bases of the metacarpal articulate with the carpal bones, and the distal edge of the metacarpal articulates with the proximal phalanges and from the knuckles. The first metacarpal, that is the thumb, is the thickest and shortest of this bone. Each digit has 3 phalanges. We have the proximal, middle, and the distal, except for the first thumb, which has only two phalanges, that is the proximal and the distal. Each phalanx has a base proximally, a shaft or body, and a head distally. The distal phalanges are flattened and expanded at their distal ends, which underlie the nail beds. The joints of the upper limb. Movement of the pectoral girdle involves the sternoclavicular, acromioclavicular, and glenohumerus joints. Usually, all moves simultaneously. Functional defects in any of these joints impair movement of the pectoral girdle. Mobility of the scapula is essential for the freedom of movement of the upper limb. You can read more about the joints of the upper limb in your course material. Thank you for listening. See you in the next class.